mean, like, it was amazing. COVID was amazing to me how well the Chinese Communist Party got, like, Western media to parrot their propaganda. One, that calling it a lab leak was racist when, like, oh, it actually came from, don't say it came from a lab. That's racist. It's what's not racist is to say it came from a wet market where people were eating bats and pangolins. That's not racist.
Yeah. I mean, even before that, they when state-run media started calling it the Wuhan virus, that was January of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And then they decided to change that because they didn't want the association with China. And then we all call it COVID-19. Which is a break from typically how the WHO has named viruses. So even the very beginning, basically getting the world to stop calling it the Wuhan virus or the China virus was a Chinese Communist Party push using racism as the reason.
And how often Western media would praise the China's COVID policies.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think even the World Health Organization was doing that in the beginning. So
yeah,
it was, I think, with the lab leak thing, what was interesting, though, is because I think it was so effective in part because there was a lot of self-interest involved in, scientists, virologists who had been doing these kinds of, gain-of-function experiments. And then if you actually explain to people what they were doing, that you're making viruses more dangerous in order to prevent a dangerous virus, then that could blow up the entire field of virology. So there was a lot of, parallels in between where their interests aligned with the Chinese Communist Party's interests in also shutting down the idea that it came from a lab. So that was kind of a perfect storm in that sense.
Yeah, I felt firsthand the censorship of that issue back in January of 2020. For a story I did in the Washington Times, I interviewed an Israeli military intelligence expert named Danny Shahom, who was an expert on the Chinese biological warfare program. And he said probably the virus came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Well, I was viciously smeared by the Washington Post and USA Today so-called fact checkers who said that my story, which was based on completely open sources, was an example of false information about the virus. And, I spent a good part of 2 years trying to make the case that it did come from a lab. And, I did a lot of reporting on it, and it's overwhelming. For example, few people know that until recently, the number of known viruses in the world were around somewhere of several hundred. Well, the Chinese, through research, they're obsessed with viruses. They've, in just the last decade, they've uncovered some 2,000 new viruses. So they're collecting all these dangerous viruses. They're manipulating them in labs, ostensibly for vaccines, but probably for biological warfare purposes. And nobody has said, why doesn't China stop doing this dangerous research? Why haven't there been sanctions on China for conducting dangerous research, which probably led to the pandemic?
It's because the most dangerous virus is communism.
Yeah.
Yes, Shelley. But this does get back to, I'm curious to your thoughts about this ideology, the communist Marxist ideology. Really, what's their goal of changing what is truth.
Well, I mean, I think you had an interesting thing in your book where you said that the ideology of Chinese communism employs lies and deception as a fundamental operating principle. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea that in order to defeat capitalism, that is the motivating drive for Chinese Marxism-Leninism. To defeat world capitalism led by the United States, all means must be used. There should be no limits on that. So as Ronald Reagan said of the Soviets, he said, they will do anything, lie and cheat in order to advance their cause. It's absolutely the same case with the Chinese Communist Party. No respect for the truth. As you mentioned earlier, this idea that China is a democracy is a total lie. The idea that China has rule of law is another total lie. The idea that China is a peaceful power is another lie. All of these things are part of the ideology driving towards making this country, this communist-ruled country, the most powerful nation in the world. And they believe in their ideology has to be replace the Western free market democratic system. So we are headed for a world run by Chinese communism unless we take steps to counteract it and to fight against it. And that's why it's so important to educate people to the realities, not just of the practices and behaviors, whether it's human rights violations, whether it's supplying missile and nuclear technology to North Korea and rogue states and Iran, but it's the ideology behind it that must be learned and understood and countered.
What do you think is one of the biggest parts of that ideology that people do not understand?
That, well, like I said, my businessman colleague in New York that time said they don't think it's coming. They think that communism is just a coat that they're wearing, that they're actually Chinese nationalists. The same argument was made about the Soviet Union. And then George Kennan in his famous Mr. X talked about the sources of Soviet conduct. And that's what led to containment. We need to do the similar thing. We need to look at the sources of Chinese Communist Party behavior. And those sources are stemming from an ideology. They're motivated by an ideology. And I think part of the problem is that we have a kind of a negative culture, which I call anti-communism, that based on the excesses of anti-communism during the 50s, that there's a virulent, not so much pro-communism, but a virulence against anyone that opposes communism. So we need to find ways to make people understand that this is not a marginal or imaginary threat. This is the Chinese communist ideology is a real and growing threat, and they are literally on the march. My view is that they're using the Belt and Road Initiative, which is ostensibly a economic and developmental tool to spread communism, because wherever they do their investment, they demand total obedience to Chinese communist ideas and promotions. And it's a real and growing threat, and people need to understand it. And I just think that we've got to do much more. And I've tried. I appealed as a result of my book I War, which talked about this information warfare, war and peace in the information age. I appealed. We need a new USIA for the information age. We need digital tools that can really promote truth. And relying on the Western media is no longer going to be enough. Right now, our news media is balkanized and politicized, and as a result, it's been less effective in being able to counter it. So this is an area where the U.S. government doesn't need to promote its own propaganda. We can do that through our news media. But what we do need to do is provide a clear and concise tool to counteract various lies and deceptions of the Chinese Communist Party that will give people the power to understand the problem better.
I mean, there's a real challenge with that, though, right? Which is that, we've seen increasingly that a lot of establishment media are willing to parrot the line of the current administration on a variety of issues, right? And so, which is to say, that indicates that the administration has a certain viewpoint that they want to push. So if you put additional power in the hands of the U.S. government to spread information, how do you prevent that from just being, essentially propaganda at American citizens for whatever the people in power want?
Which could end up being very pro-CCP.
It could be anything, but it certainly would be pro whoever's in power.
Yeah, that's why I say it's not an easy problem. And one of the problems has been that the public affairs bureaucracy in the U.S. government has become so powerful. It's kind of like the tail wagging the dog. that they have been opposing all efforts to try to do counter disinformation operations. And it is a problem. You have to worry about that, the being politicized. And I think Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter is really something that's very valuable in providing some real balance and exposing the kind of government censorship that took place under the previous ownership.
So, I mean, you've talked a lot about education and the idea that people need to understand that being against the Chinese Communist Party is not racism or some new form of McCarthyism. But what are some other things that, ordinary Americans can do?
Well, that's a good question. It's really up to our leaders to do it. So I would say that ordinary Americans can at least appeal to their leaders, especially in Congress, to really take action to try and prevent China from taking over the world. It's literally that's what we're looking at. But it's not easy to do right now. America is very divided politically, and so it's very difficult to work on a consensus. But I think that on the issue of the China threat, there is an emerging consensus between both political parties. Now, the more and more the Democratic Party is subverted and influenced by radical Marxists, that's going to make that much more difficult.